I really hope we didn't lose that.
Hey everybody, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut, and I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And I'm John Kennedy.
Okay, so today we are at Mark 9:38 to 50, and if there was ever a time to really concentrate on biblical interpretation, what is known as hermeneutics, this is the time. So here is the reading. John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him. For no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose the reward. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into hell, where their worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." So there it is. We have a passage here which certainly includes many or several of the hard sayings of Jesus. And just want to put some context around this, and then we'll interpret in that context, or maybe we'll blow the context away. We are in the chapter where Jesus is teaching his disciples at the house in Capernaum. He is seated, so he's speaking with authority. And clearly he is addressing threats to the community in this question of discipleship. And he's saying that oftentimes outsiders are not a block, that God's grace is wider than certainly the disciples would imagine. And he's also addressing insiders and making sure that the insiders are also not a stumbling block and leading people to abandon the faith. And he gives us a super uber threat to make sure that we stay in line with an immense amount of hyperbole, I think, thrown in. And then we get a call to action here that we are to be salt. And we can talk about what that is. And so the passage really comes to us in 3 sections. One is the unauthorized exorcist, that's the outsider. And then we have the warnings against being a stumbling block, that's the second. And then thirdly, the passages on salt. So that's my kind of framing of the day here, and so let's have at it.
Well, there's no question that Jesus is salty here, and I think that context is very helpful. This is, as you said, a part of Mark when he's teaching, and it seems like the way that Mark has assembled these teachings is just through sort of like connected words or ideas. So the very first one about somebody casting out demons in Jesus' name connects to the last verse of last week's passage, which talks about one of these little ones who believe in me, in my name. And then we have a couple of things based on name, and then stumbling is sort of the through line to the next part, and then of course salt. So it's interesting to see how Mark has arranged this material, which is just to say that if it seems like the sequence of the actual ideas is somewhat strange, and like, why would Jesus arrange material in this way? Well, there's a good chance he didn't actually say it in quite this way, in this order, but they're just connected by sort of key words here. So obviously we're kind of off to a good start here. We have an easy time, I think, with the ethos of Jesus in the first part, right? Whoever is not against us is for us. Like, easy. Okay, that goes down super easy. And I think it's super important, right? Because tribalism is endemic to human culture and certainly to religion, and Christianity obviously not exempt. And I think Jesus is demonstrating here that tribalism really has no place in the kingdom of God, in his way. That of course there are boundaries of certain kinds, but when it comes to anybody who is really making common cause in whatever way with us, we should celebrate that, affirm that, and welcome those people.
Yeah, I'm more and more struck in Mark by the evidence of, this new community forming around Jesus in his aftermath, and how they're so unlike any other kind of community to cohere anywhere. And it's a difference. One writer distinguished it as church versus sect. Like, when Jesus says anyone who's not against us is for us, is the widest kind of tolerance. And it's like he's trying to say everybody can be included unless they take steps to exclude themselves. And you made a great connection. I agree that the little ones refers to the previous text, the verses just before this passage, that Jesus uses a literal child to demonstrate to them that if you can receive this little child, then you're also receiving me. And the little one, the word child is the same for servant, or least of all in the Greek and in the Aramaic, according to Andrew McGowan, his latest writing. So it's, I think when the disciples here are referring to someone they saw casting out demons in Jesus' name, it's like an upstart, kind of unlicensed practitioner, and they spotted them out trying out the trick or whatever. And Jesus, let him be. He hasn't really done any harm, and he's used my name, and he's new at this or whatever. And the disciples have just been taught the verse before not to exclude and not to shun the little ones or the newbies, and they're already excluding, already using it as an example of their greatness or their smarts. And so in a way, I feel like Mark has structured something to reiterate for the community that they're not like other sects. They're not perfect and pure. They're actually, the whole game is to not exclude and to unite the human race. So I think there's a huge point going on in this first paragraph, and it sounds great, whoever's not against us is for us, but it's so much more radical, I think, than we even appreciate at first reading.
Yeah, I'd like to spend the next 2 hours of the podcast. I know you all have 2 hours to listen to this. I think this is, to my mind, just the outrageously most amazing spiritual topic there can be. And I'm in agreement with what you're saying here. I think that when I was in India on my sabbatical, I had several realizations, and one of which was by studying what His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to say about Jesus and his understanding of things. I really, really came to understand the parochialism of the Christianity that so much has been delivered to us, and mortified by the line drawing between denominations, mortified between the line drawing between religions, and mortified between the line drawing between any human beings. This is one of His Holiness's great teachings, is that we're all human beings. If we could just be human beings to one another, the world would be a much better place here. And in particular, to just touch a word about competitive Christianity here, we did get a retort on one of our pods that Rob sent around yesterday about somebody saying something to the end, like the three of us probably ought to just stick a cork in it and get over our heresy and rejoin the Catholic Church. And somebody responded with wit, and I would say a bit of wisdom, saying, well, I was never a Roman Catholic, I can't rejoin, and I'll leave off the retort. Anyway, I just want to say one thing about the Roman Catholic Church, having been one, and not to speak for it, but I think that it's possible that our friend didn't get it all right. Just even in Vatican II, the Catholic Church that I was born into was like only Catholics go to heaven. That's kind of where they were in 1959, though I wasn't exactly tracking. And at Vatican II, 1964, it kicked off. And in the great document Lumen Gentium, which is Light to the Nations, they open it up to say that not only other Christians, but also the Jewish people, and not only Jewish people, the first of the covenant, the Muslims, from the Abrahamic covenant, and those who seek God, following their conscience, and all those who seek to live a good life, or on and on and on. Even the Catholic Church, and excuse me for saying, but the Catholic Church is one of the major line drawer churches out there. The Catholic Church is trying to do away with some of those lines, inspired by, I believe, this passage. But I think personally, for all of us in the political context of our world today, I think that the one thing that we may be mortified by in understandings that come after our death and into the greater understanding of the divine light and the divine dimension, is that anytime we drew a line between us and anybody else, we were wrong. We were just wrong. And the one thing we can do to advance our own spiritual journey, to advance enlightenment, to advance the world, is to stop separating ourselves from each other. And I think it's a major exclamation point with 12 exclamation points.
Yeah, 100%.
Wow.
I think the Reformation is just more manifest line drawing that, our own church has a lot of exclusion in its history and tradition. And we draw the line at the table, we draw the line at gender, we've drawn the line at race, we've drawn the line at sexuality. I mean, there are lots of lines. And so you can't even give it all to the Catholics. But I think Jesus, he keeps saying it over and over, but in Mark, it's the earliest community that already it's in our DNA to kind of misunderstand.
Yeah, I didn't want my comments on the Roman Catholic Church to let any other denomination off the hook. We all have it.
That's the one in your background. I got it.
We're all on the hook.
I'm interested then, and amen to everything you said, but what do we do with sort of a corollary saying of Jesus in Matthew 12:30, right, that is, whoever is not with me is against me?
Yeah.
Because I think that we've drawn boundaries and excluded people in all the wrong ways, and yet to be identifiably sort of people of the way, and I want to say that in the broadest way possible, certain ways of being, right, aren't kosher, to borrow a phrase from our Jewish brothers and sisters. So how do you think about these two realities, perhaps, in balance? That everybody is welcome, and yet there are boundaries.
As you know, I mean, one of the things I said at the outset, which is, if there was ever a passage that needed hermeneutics, this is the one.
Exactly.
And because there is the scriptures and the sayings of Jesus, collide all the time with two different viewpoints, and it's and I think that the hermeneutic that I use, which is if it's not about love, it's not about God as love. If those are not the lens that you're putting on it, then I have a harder time with it. And which is not to say, in time we can get to the questions of hell that are here, and that the questions of is there spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God, and or is there a punishment where God places you in a place or something like this? I mean, all this stuff is in our scriptures, as also with universalism. It all belongs. I mean, nobody's off the hook when it comes to interpretation, and nobody gets a complete pass that their interpretation is always identifiably right. There's not a passage to go against it.
One of the things that's drawn me over these last few years to the René Girard School of Hermeneutics and Interpretation. René Girard is a literary critic. I've said his name 1,000 times, and my mother always says, no one knows what you're talking about. So I just make clear that he's an author and a literary critic originally, and out of his works grew a whole school of thought around imitative desire and imitative violence, and a study of going all the way back to anthropological origins of human sacrificial violence that was always framed in sacred terms, that a god was demanding our violent practices, and it helped unify the group, the tribe, to create a temporary peace, to exclude the scapegoat or the sacrificial victim. So I've come to realize, for myself, that Jesus arrives in our midst as a victim, and to reveal to us that God is our victim God is not the one demanding our sacrifice, but it's a human practice to sacrifice and claim that it's God's doing. And I will go to my grave to defend this idea that God is not violent and doesn't have an ounce of violence in God's self. And that Jesus' whole project is to expose what we're doing over and over again, even in this incident of, we told him to get out of here because he wasn't following us. The littlest exclusions are the sin, the original sin. So, when we get to putting stumbling blocks before little ones, it's like teaching them this practice of excluding, and they're not us and we're not them. And, in Matthew, when Jesus says, if they're not for us, they're against us, I feel like each gospeler has its way of phrasing to fit their overall message, but I think the grand picture of Jesus is that he's showing us how we exclude ourselves from the jubilee, the kingdom of God that's a place of banquet and joy and entering in, and if we're not for that, we're against it. We walk out of the party.
Yeah, I think that's right. I read something recently that said that, turning towards God without turning away from the self is the explanation for everything that goes wrong in religion, right? And I think that helps explain all of this in a way that whoever is not with me is against me means that, among other things perhaps, that when people sort of, enter the fold and then maybe claim a position of leadership in the fold, the Christian fold, but haven't turned away from themselves, right? There's egocentricity, there's self-interest, there's sense of being a separate self over and against others or whatever, then that is anathema to Jesus. That is anathema to the way that he taught and the way that the Dalai Lama and every other sort of great teacher and way of being wise and compassionate in the world holds to. So I think that goes a really long way. I see really the turning away from God and turning towards self to be, for me, sort of my hermeneutic is that's sort of the fundamental issue on fly in the ointment. As Augustine said, the earthly city, the city of man, is defined by love of self, even to contempt of God, and that the heavenly city is defined by love of God, even to contempt of self. And by contempt of self, he means sort of egocentricity, sort of me first, I, me, mine sort of thing, not respecting ourselves and honoring ourselves and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very good. And I find myself agreeing with that which you're saying. Now let's plunge in here a little bit and talk a little bit about the scandalisa, the scandal of being a stumbling block. What we make of that.
Yeah. And we have stumbling appearing quite a lot in this next block of text as sort of the through line, as I think I said earlier, and it can mean, I would say it can mean a range of things, and Elizabeth, you kind of had a gloss on it that tied it into this sort of insider-outsider exclusionary thing that we do, which I think is very valid. But given that little ones in verse 42 seems to clearly echo the last week's passage about the little ones and clearly a child, I think that there might be a specific meaning here with regard to abuse of children, like sexual abuse of children. In the HarperCollins Study Bible, it talks about these verses in this way, and that in sort of the Jewish biblical idiom, in biblical Hebrew, hands and feet and cutting them off and so on had sexual connotations with regard to lust and other sorts of transgressions. We find it in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, and it echoes certainly the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, when if you look at somebody with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. And we have a language about eyes being sort of cut out or thrown away if they cause you to sin. So that's all in the mix here. Now this is super, super challenging stuff, because not only is what I just said challenging, then we have this language of like self-mutilation and self-maiming. So it's a lot to unpack in the process, but maybe that for a start.
I feel like this is highly metaphorical here, that Jesus is, without going down the path of sexual abuse of children, which maybe it is reference to that specific thing. But I feel like Jesus here is talking about misdirecting the newcomers and the little ones, the weakest. I mean, here we have a very clear, at least parallel, if not echo of Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 12 about cutting off your hand if it causes you to stumble. It's basically the same text. He's talking about not allowing the weaker member to be scandalized, and there he's talking about some who are so advanced that they're able to overlook the meat sacrificed to idols and stuff like that. Like they can go ahead and eat it because they know an idol is just nothing and not a god. And, Paul has this whole context for his writing. But here, Jesus is instructing his disciples about, I think the hand might have to do with the things you do, the things that you're tempted to do, your desires, and the places that you want to go with your feet, if you're going to lead people into down a path of, off the path of Jesus' way. And if your eye, the things you see that you want, that you envy, there's a lot of that connotation here too. That if it's better to cut off these desires and save the whole body. Oh no.
Okay, we're back.
So I feel like it's much more about sort of desire and teaching others to be led astray.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, John, what you got out of the HarperCollins commentary has some bracing element to it, particularly what's unfolded in the church over the sexual abuse scandal.
Sure.
I think that I have perhaps maybe a different understanding of that. If we have Jesus in Capernaum in the inner room at Peter and Andrew's house, the kid on his lap in the previous thing was likely to be one of Peter and Andrew's relatives, and now taken in this story, blown out as little ones, could be little kids or could be, as you said, the beginners in the faith versus those who are supposedly so advanced. And also this question of hands and feet and eyes and all these things. I mean, this is Hebrew idiom. This is Jewish idiom. This is, the book of Proverbs goes through about every body part. And I just take it as Jesus speaking with the idioms of his day, and that he actually overturns most of this sort of thing when he says things like, it's out of the human heart that these actions come, that the major thing is the human heart, the inside and not the outside. So I take it all as idiomatic, but there's no doubt that in the church nowadays, the sexual abuse scandal has caused a major departure. I mean, it's literally been a living out of this, causing a fracture of destroying human lives and the reduction of people's trust in the Christian community. I know Pew Research poll pointed out that in the last 25 years, have to move that 25 years back a few years, 40 million people in the United States have left the community of going to church. And so this passage here, this stumbling block, there's clearly a lot of stumbling blocks out there. So, this thing which has its own outrageous violence in it. I mean, from millstone to cutting off your hands. And we find this to be like bracing, but I think in Jesus' day, this is actually how people spoke.
Yeah. I think there's no question that the language about cutting off your hands, your feet, taking out your eye if they cause you to sin is hyperbolic, and there are parallel teachings in other Jewish literature and rabbis from Jesus' time, and subsequently we find exactly the same sort of language in, let's say, the Mishnah and the Talmud, as I mentioned. But as you said, Peter, I think that this sort of spin on it that I mentioned is worth mentioning simply because of how incredibly tragically relevant it's been in Christianity. And it's easy to single out the Roman Catholic Church, and perhaps it's uniquely problematic in that tradition, but not singularly.
For sure.
It happens in
sure.
every tradition and in every religion, really.
Yeah,
I
for
read
sure.
a piece some time ago detailing similar sorts of abuses committed by leaders in just about every world religion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's definitely a thing.
It is a thing. It's a thing.
And it's a terrible thing. And I think it's a reminder that even though perhaps Christianity, imperial Christianity, however we want to define it, is responsible for all sorts of sexual repression and dysfunction. There is also something to the idea that Jesus calls us to a particular way of life, and it could be considered, as he says in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, a narrow way, and that our sexual conduct does matter, that it has consequences, and that, in all things, Jesus calls us to live by love and for love and in love, and not to be looking to satisfy our sort of selfish desires, which is obviously what a lot of people do with their sexual lives. So I think it is worth reflecting on sort of how the fullness of our life should reflect what Jesus calls us to.
Yeah, thanks.
I agree with you. I just don't want to over narrow it into sexuality, because I think we satisfy our selfish desires economically.
Agreed. Yeah.
In our tribally, geographically, all the ways,
Of course.
So I think and children are always the first to suffer. I think if one thing's also worth mentioning is that Jesus, in the last week's passage, put the child in the center of the circle, which some commentators remind us is a circle where the person is stoned who's a sinner, when the woman who commits adultery is put in the center of the crowd to be stoned.
Oh, interesting.
It's a position of guilt. It's a position of,
Interesting.
to be driven out,
Oh, interesting.
held up as an example. So here, Jesus reclaims the place of the child, and everything you're saying reinforces the idea of how expendable children were in that society, and continue to be sacrificed in our own world in many ways.
That is true. I mean, Save the Children Foundation has got a lot to say about that. So I know we have time issues here, folks, and we have not touched on two major issues here. One is hell, and the other is just all of the salt sayings. What does it mean to our lives to be salted with fire? Let's just touch hell for a little bit. Maybe that's not so easily done. But I think that for anybody who's seriously looking at this passage would have a little bit to say about that. Let me just give some context to this about what we translate as hell. In the text itself would be, as you know, the derivation of where we get to that comes from it was in its day a super deep valley in the southwest side of the corner of Jerusalem, which was a place where it was somebody's valley. We get Gehenna out of
Ben Hinnon.
Ben Hinnon, right? Mm-hmm. The Greek translation of the Hebrew. And during the time of Jeremiah, there was sacrificing of children there. And then during the period, and then in Isaiah we get the question of worms won't rest and the fire never dies. And then Josiah cleans it all up, turns it into a garbage dump, and with the smell and smolder of a lot of garbage dumps today. And then that eventually during the interbiblical period becomes associated with eternal suffering. So there's kind of like where this hell comes from.
I don't think Jesus had an idea of a place of divine punishment. I think he had the idea of this, better to do these things than to be thrown into that place, where they were sacrificing children once upon a time. I mean, in a way, it ties up quite well with what we've been talking about.
Yeah. I have to say I'm not so sure about what Jesus had in mind here, and I think there is some elements of this teaching and Jesus's teachings about hell elsewhere to suggest that he was, at least to some degree, on board with the Hebraic idea of judgment, of sort of a final judgment, a sort of separation between all that is in accord with the will of God, the love of God, the justice of God. And I think justice is actually a particularly helpful frame here, that the Hebrew God is a God of justice, and that is the logic of judgment. Obviously, justice and judgment are already very related terms. And this justice is largely a matter of our social relations, how we treat each other, how we treat the least of these, the little ones, the poor, and so on. And that God will sort of bring about a final restoration of this world that has sort of fallen, right? That's a primal sort of part of the Jewish and Christian myth, if you will. And I don't mean myth by something that's like made up, but sort of like a story that people live by, that that God created a good world, a just world, a world of shalom, right, of peace in the fullest sense, and that human sort of self-will and arrogance and so on has put the world out of whack in a way. So God will restore the world, and part of that means sort of doing away with everything that is opposed to that goodness and to that shalom. And I mean, Jesus here is quoting Isaiah 66, which is the very end of the book of Isaiah. It's this incredible eschatological vision of the new heaven and the new earth, and a restored, renewed earth where there's prosperity and joy and peace and justice and all of that. But nestled in all of that is this mention of a place where there'll be dead bodies of the people who have rebelled against God. For their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, which is exactly what Jesus quotes here. So, like, I don't like saying this stuff, but but I do see it there, and I don't know exactly what to do with it.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of discomfort to be had around all this, and I think if you added up the lines, Jesus spoke more about hell than he did heaven, if we want to strictly break that, but also just simply to say the Western consciousness, as we've received it since the Middle Ages, in the West has really led to this division and this scare and all this sort of stuff, which was not in the first 1,000 years of the church, is not in the Eastern Orthodox understanding of things. Right. Yeah. That we think about this in the correct and right way, but we are heavily impacted by the intellectual theological tradition that we've come with all this. And I would just say, I don't think we have a handle on this at all. I think that there's much to this.
I think we have enough of a handle on Jesus to say that that we're not supposed to have fear of this kind of thing, and that mythic as it is, I don't feel like God has anything to do with deciding to condemn someone for all eternity in a place of fire. And I'll walk away today if that's the truth. Yeah. And I just don't believe that Jesus had that in mind, that continually he's stressing it's a place of our own choosing here and now in this life, that hell is what we make of it here in this life. And you can look all around the world and find these places of unquenchable fire, children being sacrificed, worms never dying. Like it's hell on earth now in all sorts of places. And we have not understood how to not put ourselves there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm gonna be with you with that one. I'm going to be with you on that. And just as simply to say also the images of hell, the history of hell. There's a great book called The History of Hell, where these images came from. Of course, Dante gave the West most of our images of hell, but that's another topic. We need to land the plane here. But it is a fascinating conversation to be had about the questions of punishment of God or self-choosing, the hell that we hear, that we're the hellishness of the choosing the self. Can I just finish with Rowan Williams on this topic of hell? Mm-hmm. I go to Rowan whenever I'm completely lost. And Rowan said, my concept of hell, I suppose, is being stuck with myself forever and with no way out. Whether anybody gets to that point, I have no idea. But it's possible to be stuck with my selfish little ego for all eternity. That's what I regard as hell. I just love that about Rowan. When I did have the conversation with Rowan last fall, and he talked about petty little things, the hell of petty little things. I'm with him on that. Okay, folks, we never even touched the saltiness of things. I suppose we should probably wrap this up because we're just too long. Mm-hmm. Last year I preached the salty sermon when I took on the salt Proverbs, but the salt Proverbs are some of the hardest, most enigmatic sayings of Jesus, and it's hard to just touch and walk away from. So God bless you, and we wish you the depths of divine love, the engagement with that. And we're super grateful that you've hung in with us. We love it when you share and you comment and you engage with us and when you engage with one another with the scriptures and find the spirit of living Christ alive in your lives. So peace be with you. God bless you. See you again.